Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segments we discussed the standard and non-standard versions of thinking on the R scale and the Z scale, including the non-standard thinking type of cyclic thinking. In this segment we will discuss a special scale that measures a specific phenomenon. This scale is referred to as the V scale, which is short for the Venus scale. This scale measures a phenomenon experienced by women in terms of the biological female gender. The experiences measured by the V scale happen somewhat involuntarily and are related to the physiology of the woman. As mentioned previously, there is a certain limit to constructive processing when considering either the R scale or the Z scale. Previously, the communication types of the Z scale were presented as rolling communication, metaphysical communication, impulsive communication, compulsive communication, and compulsive-impulsive communication. According to the standard theory of psychology, there are factors which push the level of negative activation beyond compulsive impulse. This type of processing is referred to as hormone-induced compulsive-impulsive impulse. This process is related to the amount of hormones that a woman will process during the experience of vertical thinking. Theoretically, the continued stimulation leads to the experience of a complex amount of information. Previously, the idea was presented that a non-standard or unknown amount of information can be considered to be complex. This can apply to a complex amount of impulse, a complex amount of subtraction, or a complex amount of compression. When these factors are unknown, their magnitude can be represented by a complex number of some magnitude. In hormone-induced compulsive impulse, though, each cycle of communication becomes defined by this complex amount of information. For that reason, each cycle of communication experienced on the V scale can be referred to as a complex cycle of communication. In these complex cycles, essentially each aspect of the communication cycle can become based on an unknown amount of processing. Furthermore, the capacity for storing, communicating, or recalling these complex cycles of communication can become limited based on the extreme level of negative activation. For these reasons, the experience of these cycles of communication are influenced by the interpretation of that level of the V scale. As a side note which may or may not be discussed in the future, one method that can be used to mark the experience of each of these levels on the V scale is the application of an olfactory process. According to the standard theory of psychology, the process of olfaction provides a replacement for an impulse in vertical thinking. This process of olfaction, or the sense of smell, is correlated to an impulse that is about 4 times stronger than the impulse of external or other internal stimulation. For now we will not discuss the dynamics of olfaction specifically. We can identify the idea that the complex cycles of communication experienced by women can easily become associated with scent in an attempt to create a meaningful storage or method for recall of the complex cycle of communication. The V scale accounts for each of these cycles as a factor or as a level of communication. In all, there are 6 levels or 6 factors to be considered on the scale. The numbering of these factors begins at 0, with the 0 factor being somewhat trivial. The processing of this factor is somewhat redundant as it relates specifically to the experience of being alive in terms of true vitality. Even still, the personification of an individual even after their passing, or as the general idea or representation of that person, can be enough to consider their potential to influence communication in a complex way. For this reason, this 0 factor is considered somewhat redundant and hence referenced as the 0 factor. The first factor of the V scale concerns 4 complexities. In the first complex cycle of communication on the V scale, women will experience a pattern comprised of 4 dimensions or directions of movement. The experience of these dimensions are related to the theoretical subtraction or environmental pattern associated with those complexities. In a general sense, these 4 complexities are experienced as some sort of pattern. The features related to that pattern can be experienced as shape, color, sound, or some abstract. The defining aspect of the first factor of the V scale are the relationship between these 4 complexities. Sometimes the complexity can present itself as groups of 1 versus 3, 2 versus 2, 1 versus 1 versus 2, and 3 versus 1 in some cases. Defining and sorting these can be somewhat difficult since each are entirely based on some unknown amount of information that must be interpreted in order to be understood in a meaningful sense. For this reason, the first factor on the V scale can be considered as a complex identity experienced by women. The experience of these patterns can be related to the number of complexities or number of directions being considered during the negative activation. The second factor of the V scale concerns 7 of these complexities of communication. This factor serves as a comparative version of the complex experience. Women who experience this level of communication can use these 7 complexities to compare themselves to one another as well as comparing themselves to men. In a woman-to-woman sense, there is the capacity for a woman to recognize that other women deal with the complexities associated with the second factors as well as other factors on the V scale. For that reason, the second factor can be considered to be the place where women can consider each other as equal in comparison to each other based on the equal experience of that capacity for complex communication. In some sense, the view of platonic versus romantic partners can be correlated to the interaction at the second factor of the Z scale when thinking of the opposite sex. This allows women to group the complexities displayed by others in a way that correlates to a larger or smaller number of complexities. These can be experienced as another person displaying 1, 4 or 6 complexities or, in a larger magnitude, 8 or 10 complexities. The comparison of others in this way allows women to sort their overall interpretation of another person based on their comparison of these complex experiences in a somewhat instinctual way. From there, women are able to make decisions of the nature of their relationship with those other individuals based on the instinctual comparison in relation to their own experience of those 7 complexities. Furthermore, this can be achieved by using the patterns associated with those experiences in groups of complexities. For example, 3 complexities plus 4 could be considered with each of those complexities being a shape, color, scent or other experienced. These groups, whether the 3 complexity group or 4 complexity group, can be used to compare the complexity of another to the complexity of their own experience. That is, one 4 group versus another's 4 group, one 3 group versus another's 4 group, one's 4 group versus another's 3 group and so on. This second factor allows those types of comparisons to determine how the relationship between individuals can be sorted in a meaningful way. For these reasons, the second factor of the V scale can be referred to as a complex interaction. The third factor of the V scale can be considered to be complex orientation. When explaining this factor to non-women, the easiest reference would be to associate the level of 11 complexities with a terminal view of the environment. At the third factor of the V scale, there are 11 directions of movement to consider. These directions are, theoretically, out of range of any sort of interaction or influence on the part of the women. For that reason, it serves as a sort of terminal view of things that is really meant to be observed only. There are other phenomena that can be described in terms of interaction with others, especially men, which will be mentioned shortly. The experience of this third factor concerning 11 complexities is an experience that can be attained between women. However, the view from that point is not easily interpreted without experiencing it firsthand. Moreover, the nature of things communicated as a result of that view are more easily explained by women. There are ways to re-experience those complexities once a woman has been able to regain their capacity for other types of communication or thinking. In that sense, though, the experience of that number of complexities can seem far-fetched or somewhat incredulous, since the amount of information along with the sorts of interactions and relationships contains so much complexity. Even still, the patterns associated with those complexities can be experienced as groups of complexities similarly to the first and second factors. In the third factor, severe groups can comprise the totality of the 11 directions, such as 4 plus 7, 7 plus 4, 8 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 and so on. These are theoretically based on some sort of environmental interpretations as well as the interactions of those environments. The view of these complexities in the third factor of the V scale are referred to as the complex orientation. Beyond the terminal view of the third factor is the fourth factor, referred to as the big one. The big one is not limited to a specific number of complexities. Instead, there are a range of complex interactions that can be experienced between the terminal views of women. In the fourth factor, the range of complexities exists between 14 and 17 directions. These directions are experienced as 14 versus 15 and as 17 versus 16. These complexities are heavily related to the identity of the individual woman on the R scale as well as the Z scale. The magnitude of that total processing outside of the V scale along with other factors can be a heavy influence on the determination of the number of direction experienced on the fourth factor. This fourth factor allows for complex interactions and complex experiences that are somewhat unique based on the interpretation of the woman herself compared to her environment and the other women in that environment. This level of complexity is based on the extreme directions experienced in this state of processing. This experiential type of communication can be referred to as the complex range of communication. Beyond that, though, there is a capacity to experience continued stimulation beyond the complex range. In this sense, the fifth factor, the V scale, contains the view of the complex range from some additional angle or some additional direction. In a general sense, the inherent physiological processes of a woman should not lead to additional complexity. However, the exposure to certain factors, especially medication, drugs, alcohol, injury, overstimulation and others, can lead to the experience of the fifth factor of the V scale. At this fifth factor, the view of the complex range is heavily influenced by the subjective experience of the factor that leads to that additional amount of stimulation beyond the normal range. The effect of the medication or drug or injury or other factor leading to this experience can change the subjective experience of that level of complexity. The number of directions of the complex range are experienced at 19, 20, and 22 complexities. Another dynamic to mention within each of these factors is the deferral of or consideration of additional directions of movement within each of the ranges. For those reasons, the numbers of directions in each can be modified based on the experience of each woman on an individual basis. For example, in the first factor of the V scale, a woman can defer or ignore one of the directions, leaving a total of 3 directions of consideration rather than 4. Similarly, on the third factor, a woman can theoretically consider an additional direction within or between the groups being experienced, leading to a total of 12 directions being considered. These deferral and considerations are the woman's way of expressing something about their experience or influence on the situation being interpreted. These allow a sort of unique interpretation of each of the factors described on the V scale. To review, each level of the V scale is related a specific amount of complex information. Each of these factors is related to specific number of directions of movement being experienced by the woman. Standard theory identifies a total of 6 levels, also referred to as factors numbered 0 to 5. The 0 factor concern 1 complexity. The first factor concerns 4 complexities, the second concerning 7, the third concerning 11, the fourth concerning a range between 14 and 17 complexities, and the fifth concerning more than 17, namely 19 through 22 complexities. Each of these are based on the meaningful interpretation of an unknown or irregular amount of stimulation. In the next segment, we will explore another case of complex communication and its manifestation on the scale of intelligence. Please join me in the next segment where we will discuss the dark zone, which is measured by the D scale.